Welcome to the Voices of War, a podcast with a simple vision to bring to life the true costs of war through the voices of those who've lived it. I'm your host Maz, and I hope you enjoy this episode. Well, here I am again. I know I said that I wouldn't be releasing any new episodes until the 21st of February, but it would seem that world events are not keen to wait until then. And so here I am again, earlier than anticipated, with a prominent guest to discuss the unfolding crisis in Ukraine. This interview was recorded in the evening of the 26th of January in Australian time, which makes it the morning of the 26th in Europe. And my guest is someone who certainly has a deep understanding not only of the region, but also the complex relationship between the West and Russia. I hope you get value out of this episode. My guest today is Lieutenant General Arne Dalhaug, who during his extensive and distinguished career served at the highest levels of the Norwegian Armed Forces, the Norwegian Ministry of Defence, as well as NATO. I will provide a link to an extended bio in the show notes, but suffice to say that Arne's first position as a three-star general was to serve as the Chief of Defence Staff and Deputy Chief of Norwegian Armed Forces. He later served as the Norwegian Military Representative to the NATO Military Committee before assuming the role of Commandant at the NATO Defense College for the following 3 years. After retiring from the military, Arne served for 3 years in a senior management position for the OSCE in the non-government controlled area in eastern Donbas in Ukraine. Arne now works as an independent expert on NATO, Russia, and conflicts in the post-Soviet area. Today, Arne joins me to discuss the ongoing crisis in Ukraine. Arne, thank you very much for joining me on the Voices of War.
A great pleasure to be here.
Firstly, congratulations on such an incredible career. I dare say you've seen a few things and done a few things. But before we get into the weeds of the ongoing crisis, maybe we can start with finding out a little bit more about you. What motivated you to join the military in the first place?
Well, I was an old Cold War warrior, and those days, everything was mandatory when it came to the military. And actually, I never planned to join the military, but I was offered education as an officer during my mandatory service in the military. And after having completed that training, I figured out that this was actually great fun. And I decided to stay on, of course, with no idea whatsoever where I would end up, but
where it's going to go. Yeah,
but that's the short and the sweet of it.
Yeah, wow. And towards the latter part of your career, you've held some very senior positions, and one of which was the deputy chief of the Norwegian Defense Forces. And I guess that was a fairly responsible job, particularly given what's happening around Northern Europe and of course, the threats that Northern Europe has been exposed to over many decades now. How has the environment that you found yourself in shaped your leadership of the Norwegian Defense Forces?
I think it's fair to go back a little further in history than the Deputy Chief of Defense. I was the Chief of Operations in Norway at the command headquarters of Defense in when 9/11 took place,
Right.
And I was the one responsible for the operational planning of what the Norwegian forces should do on behalf of the Chief of Defense, of course, after 9/11. So I think that from then on, I really understood the seriousness of business. I mean, when you are out on an exercise, making decisions are actually quite easy. But when you are faced with the reality, you understand that what you say yes or no to could obviously cause people to die or not to die. How much risk should the Norwegian forces accept operating in Afghanistan? Just as one example. So I think this. After that, I got much more serious about it, and of course, being the deputy chief of defense the issues with Afghanistan was, of course, always with me, and also many operations outside of Norway, up in the Arctic, and that kind of activity that we do on a daily basis, where you have to assess what kind of risk is acceptable given what you try to achieve. So this understanding of that war and killing people, that's really serious business. That has stuck with me, and of course been reinforced several times, and also the 3 years that I served for the OSCE in the conflict area in eastern Donbas. So and that's why I think I've alluded to when we spoke last time briefly, that I think the decision about peace and war also weighs very heavily on the Kremlin, much more heavily than most people think.
Yeah, and I certainly definitely want to get to that because I think that's one of the key points. Is what is the risk versus gain that certainly President Putin is analyzing. But during your time then also in Donbas, because you were with OSCE for 3 years and in a very senior role, the Donbas region was of course famously pro-Russian troops, but not Russian troops as we're led to believe. What did it look like for you on the ground? I mean, was it very obvious from the start what's happening? Because certainly the narratives, and that's part of the, Putin's, propaganda machine as well, is to confuse the situation. But what was it like for you on the ground? Was it quite obvious what was going on?
Yes, for us being on the ground, of course, we were working under the mandate of the OSCE with transparency, impartiality in what we were doing. But of course, our observations could confirm that, let me put it like that Russian influence in the so-called People's Republics obviously was very strong, and of course still is. I'm a little reluctant to go into too many details because this could maybe be problematic for people I know that are still serving in this area. But for sure, it was easy to observe that the Russians have a strong hand in what's going on in that.
I mean, I guess Crimea is it's certainly no secret. That's been publicly acknowledged as well. That's now recognized, or that Russia recognizes Crimea as Russian territory, right? But I think certainly the East is slightly different still.
Yeah, I mean, of course, the only difference basically is that the Russian use deniability. I mean, they try to pretend that they are just a mediator and not part of the conflict. Of course, that's one of the most badly hidden secrets in the world, but still they keep on telling that narrative. Yeah,
well, I guess Maskirovka, right? That's part of the
probably you could call it that. That was a famous word, during the Cold War.
Yeah, part of the deception. But maybe before we get too deep into it, maybe we can just backtrack a little bit and maybe you can tell us, based on your experiences, what is the root of the current conflict? Because it's certainly nothing new. It's not new. We know that. But maybe you can give us a quick summary of what is the actual where it all started and why we are where we are.
I guess that people would even disagree where it started.
Probably, yeah. No doubt about that.
And of course we can also visit that going back to the 1991. But first, I'm not going to do that. And I mean, basically, the way most people would agree to it was that the annexation of Crimea happened in 2014, and somewhat later the same year, I mean, Russian forces also entered Ukrainian territory, and I mean, they delivered the victories to the so-called separatists at Ilovaisk in August of 2014. And also another very important battle that took place around Debaltseve, while the second Minsk agreement actually was negotiated. And there is no doubt whatsoever that Russian regular forces participated in both battles, because in the summer of 2014, the smaller ragtag people that, to a certain degree, not only on their own, but still to a certain degree, initiated the hostilities in eastern Donbas. They were pushed up against the Russian border. Ilovaisk is far east of Donetsk. So it was not much left. And the same was in Luhansk. Luhansk city, a lot of the fighting took place east of Luhansk, between Luhansk and the Russian border. So without Russian forces entering the battle, everything would have stopped right there in August in 2014.
And when you say we know it was Russian forces, one of the issues was identifying units and so on. But you're still, the level of certainty based on the information you received, it's pretty clear that it must have been because
obviously, who else could be crossing the border from Russia and turn of course fortune of war in the favor of the so-called republics. So that's very obvious. And even in Wikipedia, you can find a good order of battles for participated in the two battles. So after 2015, actually, the fighting at Debaltseve in February 2015 stopped after a few days, actually, after the Minsk agreement was signed. The Minsk II was signed. So they continued on fighting until they secured Debaltseve, which is a road and railroad junction that is important. I've been there a few times. And that was basically the end of the very hot period of fighting, So after that, the line of contact between the government side and the Russian-backed separatists really haven't changed very much. So since February, small local changes, but by and large, it's still about 450 clicks and running from basically north to south. So that was, and after that, of course, you have had more or less the trench World War I kind of warfare going on for up to now, actually.
And I think that's one of the things that we don't necessarily realize, and it's kind of why I asked that question, because I've in preparation for this interview, I had a look at the OSCE Ukraine team's website and the daily reports, and going back months. The daily reports tell a very, very colorful story of the amount of small fire engagements. In the hundreds, almost on a daily basis. Certainly nothing that's happened now in the last week, but we, going back, as you even say, years. So what's different now? Why now, and what's happening now, and what is different about this particular current crisis to everything in the past 8 years or so?
Well, the current crisis is particular in one way or another way not. What's going on in Crimea and in the eastern Donbas is pretty much as before.
Status quo now.
Yeah, it's status quo one. Last year about 80 killed in action on the Ukrainian side. We don't know the exact number on the other side, but probably higher. And so they talk about that you have a ceasefire, but of course that's a ceasefire with a lot of modifications. And that number may seem a high number, and it is. And but it was higher when I was there. You had normally quite a few casualties on both sides every month. So it's actually calmed down a little. And based upon people I speak with on a regular basis living in this area, the situation there is calm, basically. So what is new is this quite heavy force that Russia is deploying along the border to Ukraine from up north and down to Crimea. And I mean, there are discussions about how many soldiers they have deployed, but a safe number seemed to be at least 100,000. And that's the new of the situation. And of course, what also is very new was on the 15th of December, Putin handed over this document. I mean, basically demanding that the West should turn the clock back to before 1991, before the Cold War ended. And of course, that has been definitely rejected and like a fantasy. I mean, nobody is not at all ready to accept those demands. So,
and what were some of those demands? Because I think that's another really important point.
Yeah, I mean
that's what adding to the crisis. Yeah.
Absolutely, because Putin is trying to rewrite the security architecture of Europe, which is based upon, among other, the Helsinki Accords of 1975, the Paris Accord of 1990, and also the OSCE summit in Istanbul of 1999. It's basically are all, again, based upon the text of the UN Charter and giving every country independence, the right to choose their own security arrangement, democracy, no spheres of influence, and all that kind of thing. And basically what Putin is asking for is that NATO should withdraw whatever they have deployed in what used to be either Soviet republics like the Baltics or countries belonging to the Warsaw Pact like Poland. And every NATO forces should be withdrawn, and the NATO should guarantee that the border between Russia and NATO will remain as it is, which means no new members. And also NATO's partners should not be allowed anymore to accept NATO training missions. And I mean, the seriousness is, I mean, if you start thinking about it, is that Russia is basically claiming that the democracies of Western Europe should shortcut their own population. Because if you accept that Russia has a right to have an opinion about any country's foreign policy, basically you are telling that Russia has the right to just say that, okay, I hear what you guys say in this election or that, but it's not going to happen. So the seriousness of all these Russian demands is basically that Russia wants a saying that in areas where they have interest, they want a saying that is stronger than the free will of the people of those countries, which is of course completely unacceptable. So, and of course, that's why both Sweden and Finland have, I mean, felt the need, so to speak, for the first time, just to make a clear statement. It's up to the Swedish and Finnish people to decide if they will join NATO or not. They didn't say that they will join NATO. They felt the need to be clear that that's the democratic right of the people of Finland, for example. And Russia's demands basically is saying that, no, whatever you Finns are thinking about this, we are the one to decide at the end of the day. And that's what it's all about. I mean, it's not going to happen that any country will give up the right to follow the will of the people. I mean, if Finland should have a majority for joining NATO, they will join NATO. And that's what the Finnish president said.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I mean, because it begs the question, I mean, what is Putin thinking? Because, I mean, obviously those demands are not going to be met. And I'm sure he knows that. He has to know this. I mean, he has to know that Europe and the US, NATO, will not allow what is effectively blackmailing, do this else. Surely he must know that. So again, it begs the question: why now? What weakness does he see in Europe or the US right now that he thinks this is likely to get him a positive result for Russia?
I mean, yeah, you are asking the $100 million question. Because and I mean, many other people that know a lot more about Russia do have a problem to answer that in a convincing way. Because, to be quite honest with you, I mean, what he's doing is not making that much sense. I mean, why now, you said? Yes, I would have said, why not wait until after the next presidential election in the US? Why not wait after the midterms? I mean, why right now? And that in itself is very difficult to explain, because nothing has actually happened. I mean, Europe was calm and quiet. I mean, Russia was selling oil and gas to Germany. I mean, and everyone knew that Ukraine was not going to be a member of NATO and the European Union. I mean, that's light years away. Nothing. And I mean, that's probably his most important issue. I mean, everyone just was thinking that this was calm and quiet. I mean, to the degree that anything can be calm and quiet with Russia as a neighbor, but I mean, the normal kind of situation. So it's very difficult actually to explain. And of course, and I'm not convinced. I mean, some experts have pointed to, of course, the political situation in the US, the botched withdrawal from Afghanistan, the fact that Angela Merkel just left as the Chancellor of Germany. I mean, it's possible that it could be, but I mean, in general, I mean, none of these issues in themselves are very convincing as an explanation for why this urgency. And I mean, there is one possible option that I see, and I mean, it wouldn't be the first time that Russian or the Soviet Union have misinterpreted the will of the West to stay together. I mean, they have challenged the security architecture before. I mean, after the Second World War, a new architecture was, of course, established in Europe with Allied forces in Berlin, for example. And Russia, or the Soviet Union back then, tried twice to get the Allied to leave Berlin, the three sectors that belonged to the Allied. First was the Berlin blockade in 48-49, and then, of course, the Berlin crisis, as it's called, from 58 to 61, where the forces didn't leave and the Soviet Union and the DDR ended up building the wall. And also the Cuba crisis, of course, comes to mind. So it has happened before that after a lengthy period of much higher tension, the Soviet Union backed down because their assessment about what could be achieved by putting pressure on the West, I mean, the assessment was not the right one. And I mean, it's conceivable that Putin, for some reason, maybe the three reasons I mentioned, is thinking that this is the right time. Also, of course, he has the Nord Stream 2, and he could be thinking that, or just making a wrong assessment of the will of the West to stay together when you are really pushed hard. It could be. So other people have argued that it's just a pretext for an invasion because he knows that it should be turned down by NATO and the US. But I mean, none of these explanations are actually very convincing. Not mine either. So,
yeah. But I mean, but maybe that's I mean, again, part of the Russian deception plan. I mean, one of the things that we can't say is that Putin is stupid. He's certainly not that. Undoubtedly, questionable in sanity, some would say, but certainly not stupid. So we certainly can't discount that there is some surprise up his sleeve. But what is it about? I mean, the Cold War ended, and I guess one of the things that one might say is that Putin is still fighting a Cold War, or still lives in that Cold War mentality, but not in his defense, because that's not a right way to phrase it. But if one would try to understand where he's coming from, one of the arguments that comes from the Russian side is, well, NATO existed to be the counterbalance to the USSR. The USSR folded and ceased to exist as a cohesive whole, yet NATO arguably has become stronger and more influential since the fall of the wall. So what can we say about that? I mean, is there any truth to that, in that NATO, that we're partially feeding this psychosis of Putin's because we've allowed NATO to continue to exist beyond its original purpose?
Again, I think Putin has a narrative here. I for sure don't agree with him, and I mean, Putin is also a kind of difficult person to understand when it's come to this issue, because if we briefly go back in the NATO Russia history, of course, we should remember that the founding act of the multilateral relations between NATO and Russia was signed in 1997, and
he was in favor of it back then.
Yeah, he was in favor of it back
early
then.
Days.
Yeah. And also the Rome summit in 2002, when you had the mandate or the term of reference for the NATO Russia Council that was established at that time. And Putin had the opportunity to speak at this summit. And you should go back and read what he said. I mean, he was exceptional positive to NATO and to the future and everything. So, I mean, it's difficult to see what happened. And I mean, if you actually go back to 1997 and the founding act, I mean, in the founding act, I mean, they talk about new members of NATO. So this is not coming as a surprise to Putin. I mean, it's in the text. They even agreed, and that I think is being under-communicated. I mean, in the founding act, you can see that there are two, how should I phrase it, that we are giving Russia an opportunity to have a say in what NATO does or NATO doesn't. First of all, I mean, it's explicitly said in the founding act that NATO will not or does not have any intention to deploy nuclear weapons to new member states. That's one thing. And there are also restrictions on conventional forces in new member states in the founding act. And that was in 1997. And obviously, everyone agreed that there would be new members and that there would be a couple of restrictions being applied to those members that didn't apply to the old members. And I mean, those promises NATO kept. I mean, still there are no nuclear weapons, of course, forward deployed in the new member states, and forces are on a rotational basis, and they are quite small forces. So, of course, this increased a little after 2014. But anyway, still, you actually, based upon the founding act, you have a corridor between Russia and NATO of countries that have some constraints that the old members don't have. But that is not very often alluded to. But it's there. And Putin was very happy with that. And was even more happy in 2002 with the NATO Russia Council. And then, of course, 5 years later, he came to Berlin and told basically everyone that whatever happened in the past didn't apply anymore in Munich Security Conference. And after that, I mean, things have basically been going down the drain. But I mean, what happened in between, I don't know. But I mean, there was absolutely no surprise that NATO would get new members, and it's mentioned in both documents. And also, I mean, if you go back to when the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991-92, I mean, Gorbachev said clearly that NATO never promised that they wouldn't go or accept new members. The only what NATO was very clear about was that they would not expand into what was back then the DDR, Eastern Germany, and that has also been kept. It's just national German forces in that area. So, and that was basically, and of course, back in 1991, people basically were thinking that NATO would go away. So, I mean, it was no big issue. I mean, Francis Fukuyama was writing the end of history, you know.
Yeah, of course.
and so,
what a wonderful dream!
what a wonderful dream. Yeah. So, I mean, all this is quite confusing. But for sure, it's very hard to see the narrative coming out of Russia that NATO in any way should have been tricking Russia about all these issues. And we should remember that Russia never left Moldova. I mean, that happens in 1992 when Russian forces were fighting in support of the separatists in Transnistria. And they have stayed there ever since. And already in 1994-95, we had the first Chechen war against, and the second one in 99. So, I mean, you could already see that things were slightly changing in Russia. And Russia started to support the separatists in Abkhazia and in South Ossetia in Georgia, while they were killing separatists en masse themselves in Chechnya. And also, of course, they encouraged the conflict to go on in Moldova. So it's not that Russia was just sitting there doing nothing in those years, but NATO more or less turned a blind eye to that because it was not that important back then. But it has escalated, as you know.
Yeah, of course. I mean, does Putin have any credible grievances against the West? I mean, is there anything that we can look back over the years and analyze and say, hey, we might have made a mistake here. We overstepped the mark, or we pushed him too far. And I'm only trying to understand the person that Putin is and what he's seeing, because obviously he's been in power for so many years as well. And I think that's potentially part of the issue, is that, you know, his paranoia has been fueled over a very long period of time, whereas leaders in the West have changed. He's remained, and he's been able to build a much thicker, denser narrative that's, of course, fueled by his own confirmation bias, despite the fact that there are rotating leaders in the West and changing policies, changing priorities. Perhaps in his mind, you know, the West has kept its own narrative against Russia. Well, that's what he perceives. Is there anything that you can put to that and say, hey, we should have acted differently here?
And you have probably noticed that I'm not a great admirer of the Russian narrative.
No, and I mean, neither am I, of course. I mean,
what I'm trying to say is that some people may have this idea that NATO should not have accepted new members in the late 90s, early 2000. To that, I would say that, I mean, Russia accepted that with their eyes wide open. I mean, just look at the two documents that I mentioned, the Founding Act and the Rome Summit. So there should be no surprises there, basically, to be honest. So, and also, I mean, if you look at, I mean, the NATO strategic concept, I mean, I was 6 years in NATO, and I've had many meetings in the NATO-Russia Council. I mean, if you read the text of the strategic concept, the one before 2010, I mean, Russia was, explained in a very favorable way. And I mean, Russia was called a strategic partner in the concept. And in my NATO days, even as late in military committee, as late as 2008, 2011, I mean, Russia was still talked about as the strategic partner, even after they attacked and illegally occupied the 2 areas in Georgia. So I really don't see why Putin should have this much bad feelings about what has happened, because Russia was treated with great respect, and if you read all the words said by the heads of state in 2002 in the Rome summit, and also Putin's own words, I mean, they are all very, very favorable to Russia. So to the best of my knowledge, I have a hard time to see that Putin should be much surprised about new members. What he would have had something to say against was, of course, if we, NATO, deployed forward nuclear weapons or deployed forward heavy armored formations in the new member states, because that were the 2 sentences basically in the founding act, and that never happened. So I have a problem to see that the Russian narrative that should have been hoodwinked about NATO membership and all that, because that was written in the text in 1997, and that NATO would get new members. And that's why you have the sentences about the nuclear weapons and what kind of forces to deploy and not deploy in new member states.
Yeah, I mean, so really is a matter of competing narratives and creating a narrative to fuel, I guess, his own ambitions. I mean, really, it really sounds like it really just comes down to realpolitik, and it really is about a sphere of influence and the recreation of of the motherland. I guess as seen through his eyes, and we of course know in what environment he grew up in and then became a key figure. So a part of me does really believe that it is the length of his power that has something to do with it. I mean, he hasn't stepped away from this narrative at all, whereas in the West people change and priorities change and so on. I've read an interesting article. It was in the Kiev Independent, and written by the Center for Defense Strategies, which is of course also a Ukrainian think tank, and the realistic kind of analysis on the likelihood of an actual invasion, and their analysis was quite convincingly saying that the actual risk of an actual military invasion is very low at the moment, given the build-up of troops and the size of build-up, even to the highest possible range of, I think it was like 140,000 or something. But what they're basically saying is that if an invasion was to occur, we would have to have seen much bigger build-up, logistical nodes set up, strategic reserves, because any kind of invasion of Ukraine would require a far bigger mass of military power than what's at the border at the moment. But what they're saying is that, of course, it's going to be this kind of hybrid warfare piece with psychological operations and cyber warfare to really destabilize the Ukrainian mindset, I guess, and to kind of divide from within. What's your analysis? I mean, I found this to be an interesting one because it's slightly less dramatic, and it's coming from Ukraine. Not slightly; it's a lot less dramatic than what we're hearing and seeing in the mainstream media, at least.
Yeah, well, actually, I read the same myself. I subscribe to the Kiev Independent, and I can concur with a lot of what is written in that article. And of course, I mean, they are not the only ones. I mean, in Europe, several countries basically are thinking that Putin is bluffing. Of course, we don't know. I mean, I would say that possibility of a war, small or large, definitely is present. But of course, we need to take a step back and ask ourselves, why could Putin like to do that? And I'm an old Clausewitzian, so I would always start with the political objective. And the political objective, for sure, at least, is Ukraine will not be a member of NATO and possibly also not be a member of the European Union. I mean, the reason for the Maidan in 2013, in late 13, basically was that, I mean, Ukraine was about to sign some agreement with the European Union, and Putin didn't live very well with that. Of course, I mean, we are talking about who is to blame for what. But I mean, we should remember that back in 2013, I mean, in the constitution of Ukraine, it was said that Ukraine was a non-aligned neutral country. I mean, that was in the constitution. That was after 2008 when you had the possibility in theory that Ukraine could become a member. But we should also remember that back in those days, I mean, it was in the constitution, and it was less than 30% of the population that believed that Ukraine should become a member. Now it's more than 60%, and it's 20% that think Russia is an enemy. So, I mean, what would have happened? I mean, counterfactual history, what would have happened if Russia just didn't do anything when the Maidan revolution happened? Probably they already signed the agreement about having Sevastopol and whatever they needed for the naval operations. And they could just have waited that out, because I was in NATO back then. We had regular meetings also with the Ukrainian in the partnership format. And it was no discussion whatsoever of becoming a member of NATO, because people didn't ask for it. And the first time Ukraine took an initiative was in December 2014, after, I mean, the war in Donbas and after annexation of Crimea. The parliament changed that in 2014 in December. Before that, nobody even dreamed about Ukraine asking to become a NATO member. But the Russian actions changed that. And now, of course, the problem is a big one. Then, I know it's a long answer to your question, and then back to the political objectives. I mean, the political objective, and I gave a lecture about that as early as late September, early October this year, and I still think the same, basically. The political objective is to get Ukraine away from NATO and also EU membership. And for the time being, Putin is achieving that with what he's doing. He doesn't need to do anything. That's why, I mean, except of course keeping the conflict simmering in eastern Donbas, but that's about it, and that's sustainable. And and if you add that, I mean, you asked why now. I mean, that makes it even more difficult to understand why now, because he has basically achieved his political objectives already. So why is he doing all this right now? I don't have a good answer to that. Also, because it's very difficult, as basically described in the article you mentioned, to see military options that could actually deliver something to Putin. I mean, rationally speaking, I mean, if you sit down cold-headed, cold-hearted, and start to analyze the situation, I mean, what kind of military operations could hand Putin more than not getting Ukraine as a member of NATO, because it's not going to happen. And not only because of the military, also because of the weakness of the Ukrainian democracy and the weakness of the institutions. And that's also something we should remember, that a lot of people think that it's only reform of the military that is important when you apply for NATO membership. That's not true. I mean, I mean, the political credibility of the country, the political stability of the country, the stability of the institutions, good governance, rule of law, and so on, is even maybe more important, but people understand that. And the reason is that if you are entered into NATO as a member, you have got the right to make decisions about today 30 other countries. And you don't want someone coming in there and that could be another country tomorrow than it is today. I mean, that has already happened with a couple of countries. And of course, that has made both the European Union and NATO much more reluctant to accept new members because they have seen also member countries backsliding into authoritarianism. So,
like, are we talking countries like Hungary?
Hungary is a typical example. Of course, an even stronger example is Turkey.
Oh yeah, well, yeah. In fact, I've got a question on Turkey because I think that's a really interesting one. Yeah.
So I mean, Hungary is typical, but you also have the president of Croatia had a few sentences just recently. The newest member, Montenegro, in NATO, has a more Russian-friendly government than they used to have. So I mean, NATO is becoming more and more aware of that. And I mean, for the time being, I mean, it's unthinkable that any country in the East would become a NATO or a European member. So, I mean, why bother? I mean, Putin just needs to, I mean, keep Ukraine slightly destabilized and see to it that the oligarchs are basically working against any kind of legal reform, government reform and all that. And Ukraine is not going to be a NATO member.
And job done.
Yeah. So the job is done. I mean, then you should start to evaluate the political, what you can achieve by military force. I mean, one idea is that you could, of course, attack further into Donbas. But I mean, that wouldn't change the government in Kiev. And that would scare up the rest of the world. And the possibility of deniability would be lost. I mean, he would have to accept responsibility for it. And of course, I mean, what Putin really wants is to have a new Yanukovych in Kiev, Russian-friendly president. But he was ousted, of course, because of Putin's stupid interference in 2013 about this agreement with the European Union, with basically had nothing to do with security, only, I mean, business, finance, economics, that kind of stuff. So there is, I mean, that will not change. And I mean, Putin also, of course, knows that the option he once had before he did all these stupid things I would say about Ukraine was that you could actually have a Russian-friendly president elected. Today, it's unthinkable. Because that was the Russian-friendly president is below 10% of the population, basically in the East and basically old people like me. I mean, if you look at the age of people voting for Medvedchuk and the opposition platform, I mean, below the age of 40, I mean, the political party doesn't exist. So obviously, I mean, Putin must know that. There is no political support. I mean,
appetite.
I mean, once, I mean, Russia had a certain amount of soft power in Ukraine, to use that word. And but I mean, today, I mean, all aspects of soft power is completely collapsed. I mean, with the exception of the military factor, I mean, Russia is completely without ability to influence Ukraine. And they have concluded that. And of course, it's not going to be better with starting military operations.
Starting a war. Well, I mean, sorry.
Yeah. And of course, the problem is that what kind of operation are we seeing? I mean, every time I get some fancy new red arrows on a map in some obscure newspaper, I'm always thinking, I mean, this guy, I mean, did he ever think about what Russia could possibly achieve by doing this? And the answer is always, this would be a disaster. And I think last time we spoke that should remember that Ukraine, east of Dnieper, is about the size of Great Britain, with almost 20 million people, a lot of really big cities, Dnipro and Kharkov, to mention just the two biggest ones. And you will need an enormous force if you wanted to occupy that area. And then, of course, people understand that doesn't sound good, so they come up with smaller operations. You can take the Snake Island, that's outside the coast of Ukraine in the Black Sea. Yes, of course, Russia could, but why should they? I mean, it's all these options, these more minor options. And they also said that, of course, you could launch an attack from the air. It is true. You could, but would that change the political situation in Kiev? For sure not. So, and all kind of military options do have the downside that it would scare off the West. And even Germany would have to accept that the German foreign policy of the last 30, 40 years would actually be based on false assumptions, because they have based all their foreign policy since Ostpolitik on the assumption that you could actually talk sensible with the Russian leaders. And I mean, if something like this would happen, I mean, the foundation of German foreign policy would just be
collapsed.
And of course, France has already understood that they are not influencing Putin. I mean, after Putin sent in the Wagner group into Mali after French left, the French forces left, I mean, they understand that. They're not going to influence that guy.
I mean, it's really interesting. I mean, because I mean, it begs the question that if we make the kind of basic assumption that Putin must know that a military victory is so difficult in any way to imagine, for it to ever be tabled as a real option is basically unrealistic. Not only from the technical aspect of it, of actually, the size of Ukraine and the military might you would need, the supply chains, everything else that one require. But of course, then, as you just said, the soft power of Russia in Ukraine has diminished significantly. And probably what would happen, not probably, I'm sure it would be certainly that the nation, it would galvanize the Ukrainian identity, and it would give birth to an even greater resistance, territorial defense. And of course, there are famous even sports players now joining the territorial defense and urging people to join. So we're seeing this already happening. So again, it begs the question. He certainly, it would be insanity to think that he could win a military victory, especially as you again rightly pointed out, he's already achieving what he wanted to achieve politically. So my question to you then is, given the rhetoric that we're hearing, certainly in the mainstream media in Australia, all around the world, the drums of war are beating. Effectively, if an inexperienced eye looks at this, the conclusion is war is around the corner. It's inevitable. It's about to happen. Prepare because it's going to happen. Are we potentially, by purely through our own 24-hour media cycle, are we helping Putin destabilize? And the reason I asked is because I found it very interesting that even Zelensky, so the president of Ukraine, when he addressed the nation on the 19th, he himself said, the nothing is new. The only thing that's new is the alarming nature of what's happening right now. And he's saying to the Ukrainian people, just stay calm, don't fall for the rhetoric of imminent war. And he himself addressed the media, please don't contribute to, increasing the heat when, the reality is the risk of a actual invasion, a military invasion per se is basically, very low, really. So my question is our own kind of 24-hour news cycle ultimately helping Putin achieve what he wants? And that's further destabilization, further fear, further risk of some mishap from our side, and therefore then giving him some more fuel, more ammunition to, blame the West for, whatever mishap, whatever faux pas we might do because of this kind of panic that we're building?
I mean, it's it's an interesting question. I mean, it's about the story of the hen and the egg. Who came first? But I mean, we briefly talked about collapse of soft power in Ukraine. Of course, I mean, if anything happens, I mean, it would be the complete collapse of Russia's soft power also in Germany, as I briefly alluded to. So, I mean, if Putin does something, I mean, he will confirm that all the countries that have always said that Russia is dangerous, there is no need, it's absolutely useless to talk to Putin, he's a maniac, and so on and so on. I mean, their views are confirmed. And Germany is the one huge country in Europe that is basically having another view of Russia. And that's why I alluded to a few minutes ago that, I mean, if something like this should happen, I mean, soft power, I mean, Russia do have a lot of soft power in Germany. There's no doubt about it. And I mean, that would have to collapse also. I mean, the previous Chancellor, Schröder, will probably have to leave the board of Gazprom because it would be absolutely unacceptable to have the kind of relationship that Germany now has with Russia. And I'm sure that Putin is thinking about that. I mean, if there is something that could galvanize NATO, and NATO is already galvanized a lot because of this. But still, I mean, Germany is not willing to sell weapons to Ukraine, which is an issue in itself. I mean, given the fact that Germany is selling weapons to Egypt, Saudi Arabia, UAE, Pakistan, all those great democracies. Some of them even using the weapons in Yemen, but that's an.
Oh wow!
So why not sell weapons to Ukraine? And of course,
I mean, what is the German? I mean, surely it's not just Nord Stream 2. I mean, of course, that's a big, huge project that's of course left Ukraine out. Ukraine left out as well.
I mean, it's the German position is very strong on this and very strange. And but you may have noticed that just a few days ago, I mean, 70 intellectuals, security policy analysts, and so on signed a letter that, I mean, Germany needs to change the foreign policy, not only when it comes to Russia, but also when it comes to China, because I mean. Merkel has been hailed as the mother of Europe and all that. But I mean, if you really look at it, I mean, she has never taken any kind of strong statement or stood up to authoritarianism or used any kind of principles. I mean, she was much more concerned about selling Mercedes to China than what happened with the people in Xinjiang. It's kind of difficult position for Germany, and it's been the same also with Russia, because the German and Russian economy it's not only about gas. I mean, it's very, very integrated. I mean, they are the two biggest trading partners in Europe, and I mean. The reason is, of course, that, as I said, the policy is based upon that at the end of the day, there must be some sense in the Kremlins. And if it should turn out not to be, I mean, German foreign policy is in big trouble.
Then it has, has to change.
Yeah. So then let me return to what you asked me about the media headlines. And you know that a catchy headline can really ruin, I mean, many thousand words of good analysis. And of course, in this 24/7 scenario of media, I mean, you need a catchy headline quite often. And so, of course, and I mean, the media, I mean, if you read The Guardian, I think they are kind of sober about it. And but I mean, there is a reason to be concerned, obviously. I mean, at the end of the day, I always say that the history of war is also a history about irrational decisions. And at the end of the day, I mean, Putin could make an irrational decision. I mean, he wouldn't be the only one. I mean, I would claim that the US has made quite a few of them. So, that we would need a new podcast.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
But I mean, he could. So that risk is always there. I mean, we really don't know what kind of intelligence they feed Putin. And of course, I mean, if you go back to the war in Iraq, I mean, Saddam Hussein didn't get correct intelligence because people didn't want to tell him because it was dangerous.
But we also didn't, right?
Yeah, we didn't. But I mean, of course, they were generals in Saddam's closest circle. Were thinking that this is probably not a good idea. But for many different reasons, a lot of other people told him that he was the greatest, you know, and all that. And it was an article in the New York Times not that long ago talking about the decision-making system in Russia. I mean, for an old Cold War warrior like me, I mean, I remember the Politburo in Russia, which was, and the Secretary General was basically the head of Russia. Brezhnev was the Secretary General of the Politburo. And in this article, it claims that Putin doesn't have that. I mean, his power to make decisions is actually much stronger than the Politburo Secretary General during the Cold War. Because there is no Politburo around Putin. And it's true, which means that it's more important than it used to be during the Cold War, what he is actually thinking. And that's why I said that the question of what kind of information are, I mean, embassies, FSB and all, actually feeding Putin. I mean, is it a realistic picture of the world around him? I mean, could Putin live in the understanding that Ukraine actually is waiting to be liberated? I mean, it's conceivable. So we don't know, and that's what I call with irrationality. I mean, there is always some space for that, you know? And in dictatorships like Russia basically is, I mean, the feeding of relevant information to the leader is normally somewhat distorted for many different reasons. So, and I'm sure that there are many people around Putin that I would say we know for sure, that are much against what's going on. But they really don't have much of a say, even though they are important people in Russia.
Yeah.
So I mean, that's the irrational part of it. And then, of course, we have, as you say, we briefly touched upon the media. I mean, you need to catch the attention of people 24/7. So you need a lot of catchy headlines. So I mean, it's not interesting to, at least not for most people, to read a long article that basically, after half an hour of reading, concludes that there is no reason for a catchy headline. So, you see, I mean, this podcast is we are making now is basically the opposite. You know, I mean, we're talking about this for some time, and we are looking at it from different aspects. And of course, when I write for the media, I mean, the editor will always ask me for the punchline. And if I tell him that I'm not sure if there is a punchline, he said, I'm not sure we can print that.
Exactly. But that's a real issue, I think.
Yeah.
I mean, that's a real problem.
We need a punchline, you know.
No, I agree. Exactly.
So of course, I mean, this kind of worst case scenario is more easily fed than a cold analysis of what is going on.
Because we're seeing the interpretations of, I mean, there's a number of countries that have now provided weapons to Ukraine, of course, you know, famously and very publicly, the UK and now the US. Of course, I think Biden's authorized, was it Estonia, Latvia, to release weapons. I mean, we've seen a whole plane loads coming in from the UK. US is donating millions of dollars in military aid. Of course, this is all fueling that narrative. And of course, these things should happen. That's not the question. But I think it's the short-term nature of interpretation of these signals leads the world to believe that the crisis is that we are so much closer to the edge than we really are. But conscious of the time, but now that I have you, I have to ask a couple of more questions. If that's okay. Given your experience in NATO, how do you think NATO is thinking about this right now in the kind of at the higher levels? I mean, is NATO as an organization right now kind of planning for war, or what is their thinking? And of course, also, how are decisions made? Because I think it's important to highlight that you were part of the military committee, which is, if I understand correctly, it's consensus-driven advice given, that basically influence NATO military operations. So given what's happening in the various layers, and of course, various, like you said, Hungary and Turkey, how is that shaping and influencing NATO's thinking right now, NATO cohesion, etc.?
My reading of the situation is that the cohesion among NATO countries right now is very strong, actually, and of course that's and before all this started, I mean, there were very much different views on how to deal with Russia. I mean, how to deal with Russia has been the most divisive issue in NATO for many years. I mean, was that back the 6 years I served in top NATO position also? I mean, Germany and France, Italy had a different opinion about how to deal with Russia compared to the Eastern state, Poland, Balticum, and so on. And so that has always been there. And but what Putin has achieved over the last few years is basically that Germany is the one country that has a different view on how to deal with Russia compared to the others. And so the strategy has basically been very much unsuccessful. I mean, you could have the idea that putting pressure on NATO would actually divide the countries even more, but that hasn't happened. And this was ongoing also before this crisis came up. I mean, now NATO is more galvanized than it's been for many years, with the slight exception of Germany. And so he has achieved much the opposite. And of course, we have seen that NATO has already deployed forces under NATO command to Eastern Europe, fighters, troops. And France has even suggested that French troops could be moved to Romania and put under NATO command.
There's a US aircraft carrier now. I read earlier today as well.
And also NATO is deploying air force to Bulgaria and to Romania. So obviously there's a lot of cohesion in NATO right now. And in addition, many of the NATO countries do follow a separate path and support Ukraine even more. I mean, the UK, for example, the US, Canada to a certain degree. Canada will be slightly more invisible than I expected. Anyway, Canada is a strong supporter of Ukraine, and of course, Canada also has a huge Ukrainian diaspora in Canada. So NATO is very much aligned behind this, and for sure, the necessary military planning has been done already. And of course, you have also probably noticed that the US has put on alert 8,500 ground troops to be deployed to Europe if need be. So, I mean, Putin will observe all this going on, and he doesn't see much disagreement in NATO. I mean, he sees a stone wall nowadays. And of course, it is important to be very clear about supporting Ukraine. And I think that just yesterday, I mean, 300 more anti-tank missiles the US sent to Ukraine.
Javelins.
Javelins, yes. And everyone understands that Russia for sure could take a bite out of Ukraine. I mean, I don't think it would be rational, but they could. And so I think that all these deliveries of weapons now will underpin the idea that there will be a strong insurgency in occupied areas. And I've always said that's something Putin will have to reckon with. And it's obvious that a lot of Western countries will support Ukraine with the means to have an insurgency going. And of course, I mean, if you look back to the Soviet experience in Afghanistan and also in the two wars in Chechnya, I mean, it was impossible to hide the number of body bags coming back. And based upon all polls in Russia, to the degree that you can believe anything that's coming out of Russia, it indicates that there is not much appetite for more wars among the Russian population. I mean, they are poor enough as they are.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. Maybe coming towards the end, I mean, what are your thoughts on the outcome of the Blinken-Lavrov talks? And I mean, some of the analyses I've read is that, you know, it was as much as we could have hoped for, and that's a promise of continuation of talks. What are your thoughts, and how do you see this play out? If I know it's a difficult question to ask, but of course it's again, you know, the other you know, $1 million question of you know, what is your assessment on the most likely outcome? Of course, there are myriads of them, but the most likely as we go forward.
Yes, we are back to some of the questions. These are the questions that no person listening to you would like to have, because it doesn't have a good answer, and neither do I. But to be serious, I have my assumption is that, I've said before, Putin is not reckless. He's not foolhardy. And he has a history of being careful. I mean, when he has used military force, I would say it's been low risk. I mean, sending troops to Kazakhstan, low risk. Annexing Crimea back in 2014, low risk. The same in Georgia. So, I mean, he has never done anything really reckless. So, I think, as I said at the very beginning, that, I mean, the decision to initiate a war will firmly and squarely be put on the table in front of Putin. And I mean, we shouldn't think that it's an easy decision. He knows that this will change his life and Europe, and probably the rest of the world, and most likely not for better. At least he should understand it. Of course, we are back to the small part of irrationality that could still be present, but as it is. So I think that it's fair to say that from the first discussions in Geneva and also the second meeting now, there are indications that Russia wants to talk, which to a certain degree support that. And I mean, in addition to other indicators, that there is no imminent attack being planned for. Also, I don't think that anything will happen before or after the Olympics in Beijing. I mean, that will really take away the glory from China. And I'm sure that China has not been very happy about that if the question was raised.
That's interesting. I mean, so I guess it's not a surprise, but that would suggest a lot of influence from Beijing on Moscow. And of course, we know that the relationship is not always a smooth one, but certainly one that's improving over the recent past.
And of course, I don't know that they have discussed it, and most likely they haven't. But I mean, it's quite obvious in my mind that China, for sure, will not like anything bad going on during the Olympics, because this is the moment of glory for Beijing. And I'm sure Putin also understands that. So and the indications are that this week there will be a written response to the demands Putin made before Christmas, and it seems to be more meetings coming up, which I consider to be a good thing. That means that under the Kashi headlines, some serious diplomatic work is going on, and maybe again, as I said, Putin may have misinterpreted the situation, and he's looking for a way out. I mean, there are issues that could be discussed. I mean, the reason why it's not active now is basically that Russia has left the treaties. I mean, we have the INF treaty that could be again reinforced. We have the Foundation Act that I've touched upon before, with restrictions on nuclear weapons and also on conventional forces. That could be touched upon again. The sizes of exercises could be a topic. Of course, that is already in the confidence and security building measures administered by the OSCE, but Russia pulled away from it after Crimea. The latest document is from 2011, and I mean, all this is basically in place as a part of the security architecture that we do have. So, and the reason why it's not active is basically because Russia stopped doing it. The same with conventional disarmament. Russia walked away from the CFE treaty. Not that I think it matters that much, but I mean, all these are things that could be, I mean, again, put on the table to be discussed. And it could be discussed within a framework that is already established and that doesn't challenge the existing security architecture. Because, I mean, it's possible to get back on a better track than we are now without, I mean, giving anything about the fundamental principles of the security architecture. And I think that is what the US, because it is the US, let's be real, the indispensable leader that is running this. I mean, the others, of course, they are present around, but it's all about the US. And it is the old NATO, actually. US is running the show and the rest is walking carefully behind. And they know that the chickens are coming home to roost, you know, so you need to be careful. I mean, the summer is over and it's blowing a cold, frosty wind in the autumn. So it's better to stay together. And that message obviously has trickled down to most countries. So it's kind of, I wouldn't say that war is a foregone conclusion. It's a possibility. But for the time being, I see openings for a sensible diplomacy. Not the one that deserves the catchy headlines, but that will actually at least have a possibility.
Yeah, wonderful. Well, that's certainly a much more positive tone, at least, to conclude this discussion with, rather than the headlines. So therefore, I hope people do listen and do dare to stretch below the surface and dig a little bit deeper. On that note, Arne, I know you've given me a lot of your time, and I'm very, very grateful. A very insightful conversation, especially given your background. I think it lends a lot of weight to your arguments and where you're coming from. And of course, importantly, it certainly, sets the record straight on a lot of the things that we're reading in the day-to-day media. And I think that's a very calming effect, one that we need right now. So thank you so much for giving me so much of your time.
It's been a pleasure talking with you.
Thank you so much.
Yeah. Bye-bye.
Thanks for joining us for another episode of The Voices of War. You can access all episodes on www.thevoicesofwar.com or by subscribing wherever you get your favorite podcasts. And while you're there, please give us a review, as we'd love to hear what you think. If you'd like to recommend a guest for the show, you can reach me on info@thevoicesofwar.com.